So today we have a workshop on test workshop as we were running this design challenge from last month, which was like 4 week workshop, 4 week design UXT challenge that we had in different phases like research, define, ideate, prototype, and test. So this is our fourth workshop that we have for this design challenge, which is by Jennifer Fast. She's our amazing mentor that we have in our IterateUX. So thanks, Jennifer, for taking this workshop. Okay, so moving ahead, I'll quickly introduce about IterateUX community. So we are here where we have different types of different professionals, UX people that we have. We have designers, researchers, writers, and and different levels of UXer that we have in our community, and we provide a platform like a Discord platform where people can learn, connect, and grow with each other. Moving ahead, what all things do we have for our UXers? So we usually have our weekly events. Each week we have different topics, different event. Then we arrange coffee chat and podcast also on our Discord platform. We do have our monthly whiteboard challenges where people can come and join the challenges, sharpen their interview skills, communicate with others, collaborate with other team members. So that's how people can learn and grow in the whiteboard challenges. We do have a portfolio and resume reviews on our Discord platform. Feel free to use that. Currently, we have stopped for live portfolio reviews because of this design challenge. But after the end of this September, maybe we can again start the live portfolio sessions. Then we do arrange the design challenges, UI design, UX design, user research challenges. Feel free to come and join these challenges and get more experience and practical sessions on these things. Moving ahead. Okay, so our next upcoming event is, so we have next 3 weeks for live presentation and critique for our current design challenge. So September 15, September 22nd and 29th, every Thursday at 5:30 p.m. PST, we'll have live presentation and critique. One of our mentors will be there to provide reviews and critiques over there. We have limited seats available for the live presentation, so the people who will be connecting there, they will get the chance. So we will announce those as well. And then on 29th of September, we will be announcing the winner for this design challenge. Moving ahead, a few rules out here. Unmute yourself if you would like to share something at the Q&A session. So we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So you can unmute at that time and feel free to ask any questions in the chat window. Then what else? Every Thursday we have 5:30 events. Engage in our Discord with different channels and start conversation. You will get help from our mentors and help others as well. And be kind and have fun. Okay, moving ahead, we do have a support us link out here. Feel free to donate us. We all are volunteer over here at IterateUX as we are a non-profit organization. If you really like any activities, challenges, events, and those kind of stuff, feel free to donate $1 as well, which will help the community. Okay, moving ahead, I can say one more thing. Alice, she's our moderator today, so she will be sharing some links out there in the chat window, networking sheet. If you would like to network with others, feel free to share those links out there. We will be sharing volunteering registration and mentor registration as well. If you would like to volunteer with us, feel free to register over there. We will connect with you shortly. And yep, we are good. Now I will hand over it to Jen. So I will stop my screen sharing. Jen, you can go ahead.
There we go. Look good?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Padma. Welcome, everyone, to the final week of the Design Challenge, which is our testing week. So now everyone has done some discovery research. We've all looked at kind of what problems are we solving, how do we ideate around them, and how do we actually create prototypes. So now we're going to be looking at how do we actually get those prototypes in front of users, and how do we collect some information and some data that can help us improve what we're designing before it even gets into a development sort of cycle. to make sure we're not kind of wasting our time, wasting any resources, making sure that we're solving for actual user problems. So on the agenda today, much shorter if you joined the first research workshop I did. This is a much shorter agenda. So now we're starting off with why are we testing? So why should we always bother with user testing in the first place? And also what's some of the repercussions that we may encounter if we actually forego user testing and decide to just create our designs and start pushing it into development? After that, we'll look at the differences between qualitative and quantitative data. For this particular phase, I'll be focusing primarily on the qualitative data and methods, because on the quantitative side, that typically requires really large participant pools with a lot of recruitment and a lot of specialized skills to do the actual analysis, and it's a quite rigorous process. So for today, I'll be staying away from the quantitative side, but I did want to call out kind of what are the differences and how you can start collecting some of the quantitative data, even in a qualitative fashion and methodology. After that, we'll be looking at everything usability testing. So we'll start off by looking at what it is, what are some things that we should keep in consideration when we start scoping out our usability tests, and also best practice tips for setting up a usability test. We'll also kind of step through the process, as we did in the first workshop, of defining the scope of our usability testing. So I'll actually have a process for you to kind of go through and write down why you're choosing each particular thing and start setting up what your test will even look like. And then after that, we'll take a look also at content testing. I am admittedly not an expert in content testing by far. However, I got some information from some other mentors about content testing, which has been really helpful. But I did want to call out that content testing is also very important to include within the usability testing or as a separate test altogether as well. And that can be content in the way of text. It can also be visual content as well. And we'll look at how you can test for things like usability in content, readability, or even accessibility. And then as usual, we'll close out with our Q&A at the very end. So starting off with why test? So why should we make sure we have a testing phase for our product lifecycle to begin with? So even though we did do discovery research at the beginning of our challenge, it is still necessary to do follow-up research once we actually have designs in place. So through testing, we're able to discover problems in how we design our products. So that can be things like the icons we use were maybe not necessarily recognizable by people. It could be content being confusing and not necessarily clear in process. It can be interactions that are interruptive to the experience and therefore detract from the user's experience, or even just not being able to figure out how to complete a key task to begin with. So if users couldn't figure out how to successfully check out of their cart on a shopping site, you'd bet that company would basically go out of business very quickly. So this is a very important step to be including. We can also gather data to help us prioritize problems that we find. So we can assign severity to the problems that we find to determine where we should be focusing our efforts. So even though we may discover 30, 50 different problems, we also need some of the data that we gather in this testing phase to decide what problems should we be chasing after and what is going to be the most important things to focus on as we look to fix things for the first iteration, the next iteration, and thereon. Testing will also show how users may interact unexpectedly with your product. So even something as simple as a cup, for example, typically use a cup for holding liquid for drinking, but a lot of people also use it as a pencil holder. That wasn't necessarily the intention of a company who created the cup, but the user could use it in a very unexpected way. And this goes the same for design as well. Even though you design something with a particular purpose in mind or a particular function, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it's going to be perceived and used by actual users. So by actually putting the design in front of them and taking them through different tasks, you're able to then see how they interact with things, how they perceive it, and how they actually would end up using your product. Also, an important part of real-world testing is collecting and tracking metrics. So by setting a standard scorecard of metrics to collect, you can actually show how a change in your design could affect different metrics, for better or for worse. This is very helpful when you're actually iterating on a design multiple times so that you're able to keep a pulse on the experience. It can also help you identify further research to be done and also topics that you might want to deep dive into as well in follow-up research. Without these metrics, it can actually be quite hard to quantify success and even improvement in a product. So as you're going through different iterations of designs, without these metrics attached to it and and evaluating it at every iteration, it's hard to say what kind of experience or backend changes occurred and know how to go about any future research to deep dive into why some of these changes happened. So this is very important to keep track of. It also shows where there's opportunity to grow in some metrics that are going to be lower rated than competition or lower rated than you would want for your business in general. We also want to make sure that all of our essential tasks that are core to really the majority of our users are going to be doable and preferably easy to learn and perform as well. And finally, by doing testing ahead of development, that means we can actually catch and change issues before they're committed any further and before they potentially damage our trust with our customers as well. So it's very important that we do this testing phase ahead of committing any further resources so that we're able to change important parts of the process, iconography, content, whatever that may be, before it goes in front of actual users. Not actual users, but before it actually gets put into the wild. So just as we have qualitative and quantitative research methods, we also have qualitative and quantitative data. So qual data is observation-based learnings. So things like open-ended question answers from a survey. Even though surveys are typically a quantitative method, you can still get qualitative-like answers and insights by having this open-ended text question in it. They can also be things like verbatims from users while they are testing. So you may have heard of think out loud, where people are doing tasks, but as they're doing the tasks, they're actually thinking out loud through the process. They're saying, I'm navigating to here because I think that will take me to the right place where I can actually go and add this item to cart. And so you can kind of get an idea of what their thought process is like. All of those verbatims are qualitative bits of information that show you kind of how they're thinking and what they're experiencing as they go about a task. So qualitative data is really useful when directly assessing a design where you are observing a user use your design or product. It's also really useful when there's a need for follow-up questions. So where quant data can expose a problem's breadth and how many people may be affected in the general population, qualitative data can actually get to the root of the problem through understanding the participant's thought process, and also it provides more flexibility in flow and requires less standardization and rigor than quantitative data collection typically requires. Some of the typical questions for gathering qual data include things at the bottom here. So things like, how do you feel about the process you just went through? Why did you navigate to shop all in particular versus navigating through any other way or even searching? Is there anything that stood out to you about this page? And if you had a magic wand and could change anything about what you just went through today, what would you change and why? These are all very broad, open questions that allows the participant to kind of start with a very broad answer. And as they mention things that you're interested in, you can start some follow-up questions or probe in particular areas that they mention and start going deeper to uncover what are the root causes of the way they think and why they do things the way they do. On the quantitative side, so quant data is metrics-based and focused on numericals rather than verbatims. So you can think of qualitative as being things that people say and quantitative being more like what people do. So it also looks at how many or how much. So for example, how many people are able to check out of their cart successfully, or how much time it takes the average user to find the item they're looking for. So quant data, in contrast with qual, is useful for indirect design assessment, evaluating task performance, understanding participants' perception of usability with your product, comparing directly to competitor products, and when there is a need to have a high level of confidence or statistical significance in your findings. So things like if you're in the healthcare field, you obviously want to make sure that with such dire consequences, everything is going to be at a very high level of confidence that if I say, if they take this medication at this time, nothing will go wrong. So let's put in a notification for that time. If that's wrong, the consequences are that people could be very affected. They could die even. And so for these fields, they actually rely very heavily on quantitative data rather than qualitative because it looks at surveying so many different people. Qualitative typically has a smaller user set where you're only looking at talking to 3 to 5 people, maybe upwards of 15 at a large set. But on the quantitative side, you often hit sets of 300 people all the way up to thousands of people that you do analysis on. So while quantitative provides that kind of broad look and a lot of confidence, qualitative allows you to really be flexible and go really deep into understanding the whys behind the quantitative data. So oftentimes they go hand in hand and it's very circular, just as the product lifecycle is very circular. You'll find qualitative data informs quantitative data, and quantitative data also informs qualitative data back as well. For the purpose of this phase, as I mentioned, we'll be focusing on qualitative, if just because quantitative gets very techy and very analysis heavy in methodology. So we'll be focusing more on the qualitative side, but we'll look at how we can include some quantitative questions to start getting some feel around some of the metrics that we may want to be tracking as we go along in our design process. So at this point, now that we've reviewed why we should be testing and also the differences between qualitative and quantitative data, let's grab our pencil and paper, or even just set up a note on your computer or phone so we can step through the process of setting up our first usability test scope for this phase. So we'll look at an overview of usability testing, and we'll go into detail on the strengths and weaknesses of moderated versus unmoderated, remote versus in-person, and also explorative versus assessment versus comparative research as well. So while you're getting that, most of you are probably already familiar with usability and usability testing. It is still one of the most frequently used evaluative methods in user research, and it often runs in tandem with iterating on design prior to development or even during development and past that. So usability testing focuses on goals and tasks to find flaws in the design and flows associated with them. Through this, we can uncover opportunities to improve our designs and processes, and even learn more about our user past and what we learned in the discovery phase. So it can even go back to adding to things like personas you may have set up in the discovery phase. Some things to consider when going into usability testing is whether to do a moderated or unmoderated test, whether to do it in person or remotely, and whether to focus on an explorative, assessment, or comparative purpose. So we'll look more deeply into those different areas and start figuring out which makes the most sense for what you need and what your project is focused on. So we'll step through the process of setting up the scope for our usability test. First, we'll take a look at defining key tasks and goals. So in this first step, we'll be listing out tasks for our participant to attempt in our testing. And once we have that list of tasks, we'll also look at how we can prioritize them by importance to ensure that we're separating the necessary tasks from the nice to have tasks. And that's because, unfortunately, we can't test every single thing. It's always good to prioritize where our focus should be in testing. And we also want to make sure that we're not exhausting our users. We can't have them go through 80 different tasks in an hour. That would be quite terrible, honestly. You don't want to put anyone through that. So we need to make sure that we're hitting what we consider to be the most important tasks, followed by what we consider to be nice to have tasks. We'll also need to create flows for each task in our prototypes to use in the testing. And I have some notes on that as well, just some best practice tips to keep in mind, even though you've already technically gone through the prototyping phase, just to make sure that everything is in place before we go into testing. I've run into quite a lot of hangups in the middle of testing because prototypes didn't work quite the way I wanted, or something happened in the test itself with the user doing something unexpected that ended up not being the best experience for the user. In the second step, we'll talk about what metrics we should be tracking and why. And so here we'll identify a set of key metrics to evaluate how our product is performing. This can be really helpful, again, in the real world where you're trying to iterate on a design and need to know how your changes could have affected your metrics. And after that, we'll look at deciding a method. So this consists of 3 areas, as we went through before: moderation, format, and purpose. We'll go through the strengths and weaknesses of the options in each of those areas to help decide what type of testing we should be looking at running. And finally, we'll review our recruitment strategy. This is going to be very brief because it's going to be very similar to our recruitment in the discovery phase, but I wanted to bring it up again just to provide time for us to kind of reflect on our experience in recruitment and try to improve our recruitment strategy going forward. So let's get started. So starting with our first step, defining key tasks and goals. So at the very top of our note, let's start listing out some of our top of mind tasks that we expect our users to go through. So while we're listing tasks, consider how long they may take a user to do. We don't want tasks that run so long that it's hard to define what a full success or a partial success or failure looks like. So if based on your current design, a task may take too many screens for the user to go through, you can always split up a larger task into smaller pieces. So for example, rather than having a participant look for an apple on Safeway's site and finish buying it, you can break it up into first having them figure out where to find that apple in the first place. The follow-up task can then be adding it to their cart. And then they can go to checkout and complete their purchase. So that's an example of taking that larger task, but splitting it up into more bite-sized pieces that still follow a logical flow and still allow some flexibility in how they navigate, how they add it to their cart, how they go to checkout, but it still follows the logical flow of the task overall. Another consideration here is what tasks are related to others. So especially the ones that are dependent. When we do usability testing with users, we want to make sure that there's a logical flow to our tasks. It doesn't make sense to have them try editing in order without first creating an order to edit in the first place. And so this will reduce confusion on the user side and will help you figure out what is kind of a logical flow for your tasks to take. So while you're listing out some of those tasks, once you have a few listed out, we also want to figure out how to prioritize the most important ones from the ones that we may not need to test at this very moment and could leave for later tasks. For this, consider how many users perform this task. If it's the majority, or if it's a feature that doesn't, that would provide some kind of core functionality to the product, then that's something that is going to be a higher need to test versus something that is not really going to be used or provides a minor feature to the product and not something that is core to the product itself. So an example of this is a share feature. So on a site like Safeway, sharing is probably something that's not very highly used. It may be used by a small set of users or in a small set of consequences and contexts. However, it's unlikely to be widely used. But that same feature, the share feature on something like Pinterest, is considered a core function of the product, where all of the feature and functionality of Pinterest hinges upon being able to share it to network, being able to share it to other people and discover new things as well. So also consider how often users would perform this task. And this can help you prioritize tasks even past that consideration of how many people are even doing it to begin with. So with this conjunction of how many users do you expect to be doing this task? Is it something that's a core functionality or is it something that's just an extra functionality? In conjunction with how often people would be using this task, you can start to see where some tasks are obviously going to float to the top and are going to be top tasks that you're going to want to include for sure on this first round of usability testing. And so this is where it gets a little bit complicated, where you're going to have to figure out and kind of step through the process of how long you expect someone to take on a task. And as you go through, you can see, okay, they're taking too long on finishing these 8 tasks. We're going to have to reduce it so that we can fit it in within a good amount of time for us and for the participant. And so you're going to need to kind of walk through yourself and track or even test it with some random people, even if they're not in your target demographic, just to make sure that the timing is there and just to make sure that you're really prioritizing what needs to be prioritized. And after this workshop, you'll need to also create appropriate task flows in your prototype to use in your testing. So I know some of you have probably already done that, but some things to consider there. One is making sure that everything is appropriately linked forward and backwards. And so what I mean by that is when a participant is kind of navigating through a flow, you've asked them to do a particular task, but then they hit something wrong. They go somewhere they didn't expect. And so they try to navigate backwards. If they're unable to navigate backwards and you're only able to go forward in your prototype, then it's very disruptive to their experience and their thought process. And it becomes very unnatural where you actually have to reset the prototype and go through all the process again just to get to that same area. So you want to make sure that you are backwards and forwards linking everything where it makes sense so that if they happen to click on something wrong, they're able to easily undo it and continue on from where they were. Another thing to consider is to what extent does the prototype need to be linked to account for a participant error? So we don't want to be spending so much time that we're linking every single little thing on every single screen and making sure everything goes to the right place. That is really exhaustive and really just takes so much time to make sure everything is linked correctly. And then oftentimes you run into issues in the linking where you forget to link one thing, which messes up another thing, and it's a whole chain reaction. So there's going to be a point where you're able to account for some level of user error, but you're not going to be linking to things that obviously don't make sense for the task that you have at hand. And if they happen to click on that and it doesn't go somewhere, you haven't linked it to another design, then you can always tell them at that point, sorry, this is just a prototype, as we mentioned in the beginning of this test, but everything is going to work because it's not actually in development yet. But I'm curious, why did you click there? Why did you decide to go there? What was your thought process and what did you expect to happen after that? So you can still get some of the information that you would have gotten as they went through there, even though they were blocked. And also consider, does it make more sense to have a continuous flow for multiple tasks or to create a separate prototype per task? Some flows are obviously going to link to other tasks. So if you consider in the beginning, I mentioned that task with Safeway, finding the apple, adding it to your cart, and checking out. That can all be done within one prototype flow, even though it's technically separate tasks because they are all dependent on one another. They're all related. However, if you're looking after that, after you check out, at going into your account settings and changing your account settings, for that, you have to consider, do you want them to stay at the end of the checkout and then navigate into their settings? Or do you want to just start them all the way at the beginning? What makes the most sense and what would be the most natural to the user given what you know about how they use similar products and similar services? So the next step, now that we've kind of listed out some tasks and hopefully you've gotten to some considerations on what you would consider to be the top level tasks that you definitely have to test versus some of the tasks that you may be able to leave out or you can get to if you happen to have the time. This next step is to figure out what metrics we'll need to be tracking in our testing. So I mentioned, even though we're looking at it from a more qualitative methodology perspective, we do still want to have some level of metrics attached to kind of get an understanding of what people mean when they say this was a great experience. Well, what does great mean in the grand scheme of things? Does that mean that it's a 7 on the scale of 10? To some, it may be 7, to some, it may be 10. And so it lets you have more granularity in the verbatims that are typically very broad and not easy to really say where that scale fits in. So let's first consider what we know about our user from our previous research. We want to make sure that the metrics that we're tracking are going to be things that are important to the user and or our business. And this is typically really the top problem that I run into, especially in research, where oftentimes we're tracking your standard things, but with no rhyme or reason as to why we're tracking it. And that can look very different depending on what product you're researching. For some products, things like time on task makes a lot of sense. For shopping, right? Some people are going to want to finish their shopping flow as soon as possible. They just want to get what they need and get out there. They have to cook dinner for their whole family. They don't have time to be looking around. But for other products, time on task may not be so important. And in fact, time on task can be something that you want to be longer rather than shorter, because it may lead to higher quality rather than time spent. And so you're going to want to consider what you know about your user from your previous research to determine what kind of metrics are going to be important and whether it's going to be more important for them to have less time spent or more time spent, more quality, less quality. What are the trade-offs that are important to them? And so this can be things like being able to finish their shopping as quickly as possible, as I mentioned, or even just being able to find what they need easily on a site with so many products, or just getting the best quality product in the first place. So if you have any information on how they define success, the user's success, when it comes to your topic, that's also very important to consider. So for example, in discovery, you may have found that the people you talk to defined a successful use of Steam is being able to chat with their friend, set up a game for them to join, and play it together without any kind of interruption. And so some of the metrics that could be associated with that is things like, how easy is it for them to set up that multiplayer game? How long did it take for them to set it up? And also, what amount of in-game interruption occurrences happen throughout a 30-minute gaming session? So these are all quantitative metrics, but they give you some kind of gauge as to what that person's experience is like and would therefore then affect their qualitative data as well. When you're identifying metrics, also consider what can be numerically tracked. So we want to make sure that everything in the metrics area is quantifiable. So even if it's a more experiential metric, for example, how the user perceives the ease of navigating to multiplayer games, we want to provide a set rating scale to measure against. So it's not simply asking them, how do you feel about being able to find out how to create those multiplayer games? They might say, pretty easy. Well, what does pretty easy mean? We need to make sure that we provide that scale so we know exactly where they're rating and how that may compare to other people. One of the difficulties in task success is how to consider a success versus a partial success. So for example, if someone found the apple through Safeway's homepage rather than going through the navigation menu or searching, would that still be considered a success of testing navigation? If you were looking to test specifically the menu, technically that would then be a failure. So it's very important that you define what would count as a success and what criteria falls under a success versus a failure. And oftentimes when we talk about metrics, we're talking about things like time spent on task, number of clicks, number of errors, but we also do want to consider more experiential and perception-based metrics. And these are typically missed a lot in real-world settings where we're so focused on what is our conversion rate as people go through the funnel for all the way to the end of sales. We're so focused on that we also miss out on the chance to collect these more experiential metrics, which are also very important because someone could have checked out, but if they weren't happy with the process, they may not ever come back. And so we need to capture what the experience looks like on their side within the metrics as well. And so that can be metrics like how attractive the participant perceives the design to be, or how easy they felt it was to complete a task. While that's not a technical, like hard metric to capture, it's still something that's very important to consider. And also, as a side note, when you're iterating on designs, you'll also want to continually identify whether a metric is showing usefulness in conversations and revisions. And so you might have this base scorecard and you might go into version 2 of your design and find out that actually some of these metrics don't really make sense. They're not really adding anything to how we're seeing movement in our designs, and they may not actually be accurate to what we want to track. And so feel free to always be flexible with it. You can always decide that you want to drop some metrics. You can always say, actually, we defined it in this way, but actually, let's look at it a different way. There's always different ways to go about collecting the metrics, and always be flexible and open to changing it. And as we learn more about the user behavior, again, feel free to alter it to better reflect what is important to them and your team. You're going off of very little research, honestly, right now. I suppose I don't assume you got that much research in this amount of time. If you did, then hats off to you, that's great. But given how little we know about our users, chances are through some of this usability research, we're going to learn more about them. And so we can always be flexible in how we consider their success and how we decide to track whether we're making improvements, actual improvements on our design or not. So now we'll look at deciding on moderation, format, and purpose. So moderation takes a considerable amount of time to set up, plan, recruit, moderate, and analyze the data. On the other hand, unmoderated testing is typically a much less resource-heavy method, but it misses out on being able to probe and ask follow-up questions at length. And so unmoderated testing, being less resource-heavy, could also allow for multiple rounds of design and testing of iteration. And so while you have some of these trade-offs where it doesn't go quite as deep, given that you have a very set timeline for this challenge, you may say, we don't want to go as deep. We want to uncover as many usability issues as possible, iterate on them very quickly, redo the testing, and see if they run into that same issue or if they perceive it as a better experience. And so we can continually, very quickly, get a lot of iterations in. Whereas moderation is going to take much longer than that, but you'll be able to get to very root causes of what the problems with the usability issue is in the first place. And so as you're designing, if you had times where you were unsure what direction to take due to lack of data, you would also be able to gather that data through moderated testing in this phase as well. So it can also help you inform some decisions that you may have made just in a black hole because you had no other information to go off of. And oftentimes we don't consider that when we're doing our research in the discovery phase. But in hindsight, we realize we probably should have asked that question. this is the opportunity to go back and ask that question. This could better inform you of what design pattern could be best fit and why, and even how to improve your existing patterns. So when it comes to remote versus in person, remote provides much wider access to participants. This is like really beneficial for those hard to find groups because it allows a much greater reach. That being said, in-person testing allows you to actually see the participants' body language, things like whether they pause over a button. You could probe into, hey, I noticed that you kind of paused for a little while. What were you thinking? Remote moderation is much harder to capture all of these details because you are limited in your view. It's limited to the camera. In-person also allows for contextual inquiry, so actually being able to see the participant use your product in a place and at a time that they normally would. So it seems very minor, but things like even the time of day that they engage with your app could actually affect their mood. They could be very stressed at that time. They could be thinking, I have to run to the store and grab everything for dinner. I don't have time to be doing this. And that can actually affect your results. So that's where having the in-person contextual inquiry really helps, that they would normally be doing it at this time, at this place. It sets the mood, it sets the right setting and all the right context for them. Mobile apps are also generally hard to test remotely and often require a mobile prototype on a website, which is, of course, not ideal because the interaction is definitely not the same and it tends to be not quite accurate to viewing it on an actual phone screen or screencasting their phone screen, which leads to missed body language, such as the pause I mentioned earlier. So there's some trade-offs that you have between both remote and in-person that you're going to need to consider. And for purpose, we have explorative assessment and comparative purposes. So explorative follows a very naturalistic approach of allowing a participant to interact with your solution basically however they see fit. So you're not leading them through any tasks. You're basically saying, here, look at my app, have at it, see what you think. And so it's very little structure to how you go about it. But it's very interesting because that gives you the most natural view in how people would naturally use your product in the wild because you're not leading them to do any particular things. On the other hand, on assessment side, when your purpose is more assessment, you're looking at doing your typical task analysis. So you're seeing, okay, based on these tasks, how does the participant perform? How do they feel about that task? How do they feel about the product overall? On the comparative side, very similar to assessment, we're going through a set of tasks, but you're also going through that same set of tasks on a competitor product as well. And so there you get to see the participants' preference between the two different competitors, or even more if you wanted to include more. And you can see where there's some pros and cons to your design versus other companies' designs, or even some gaps as well. So we'll go a little bit deeper into each of these three areas. And so I basically want you, as we go through moderation, format, and purpose, to note down which method you think best fits where you're at in your process and knowing what you know about your users. So for moderation, again, we have moderated and unmoderated. So on the moderated side, it's going to require more planning and more resources. That's just the be all and all of it. And so if you don't have the time, you don't have the resources, that already makes you probably want to go a little bit more towards the unmoderated solution. But on that hand, moderated also allows for flexibility in structure. And so you're able to go off script. You're able to discover things that wouldn't normally be uncovered in unmoderated solutions, even if you're following a set amount of tasks. If someone starts going off the actual flow and actual path, you're able to query into where they're going, why they're going, what they're expecting to do and see there, so that you can get a better understanding. On the unmoderated side, they would basically hit a brick wall and say, actually, I have no idea how to do this. I will abandon this task. I can't complete it. And so you don't learn about where they were going, what they expected to do there, why they were going there in the first place versus where you had expected them to go. You don't get that deep learning. And so that's a big trade-off in the moderated versus unmoderated world. That being said, on the moderated side, you are technically more set in what you can do in the structure because you're just handing off basically a checklist to the user and having them try to go through that checklist. However, unmoderated testing being less requiring less planning and less resources is also typically run much quicker. And so again, you can go through iterations much quicker, uncover problems, do some probing separately. You could contact them, for example, directly if it's someone that you know, and ask specific questions about the things that they did, and just async it instead of having to spend all this time with the person and then go back quickly into iteration, set up another test and run it again. On the moderation side, because it's so deep, it requires a lot more analysis, a lot more time on figuring out root causes of everything, how to change all of it, and all of that. It just requires a lot more time. So there's some trade-offs there. If you'd rather go quick and hard, unmoderated is probably the way that you want to go. But if you really want to get into root causes and why things are happening, where people are going, if you have complex tasks, that is best left to a moderated format. Speaking of formats, we also have remote and in-person. So as I was mentioning, on the remote side, flexible on location. So you can recruit from the other side of the world, really, as long as they meet your target demographic. And so again, very helpful for people who are, for example, doing accessibility. If your topic is accessibility and you don't have someone that you know that is within your target demographic, remote is probably going to be a much easier way to find people than going into in-person. And it's also typically a quicker turnaround because scheduling is just much easier with remote. Everyone can take it from wherever they want, more or less, within your guidelines. Whereas in person, you're going to have to set up, okay, where are we meeting? How am I getting there? How much time can you spend with me there before you have to leave and do something else? So remote allows for some flexibility there, some quicker turnaround. Remote also has a need to set strict test environment requirements because you don't really have control over their environment. So typically this includes sending out a protocol to them beforehand and saying, hey, it would be great if you check your internet connection. Make sure you're somewhere that has very good internet connection so we don't have any interruptions or drops. On the side of interruptions, make sure that you're in a quiet space so I'm able to hear you and that we don't have to keep repeating things or that you don't have any interruptions that occur outside of what you obviously can't prevent. It's also harder to do mobile app testing again. You're going to have to figure out some technological ways to get around some issues there. And it's also limiting in technology familiarity and capabilities. So if your audience is someone who doesn't typically use technology, remote is probably not the best option for you in the first place. So do consider your target audience and how familiar they're going to be and how easily they'll be able to actually get onto remote solutions with you and also do the tasks on remote solutions as well. For in-person, again, it allows in-context observation. That's just an extra add-on. You don't have to do in-context observation with in-person meetups, but it's always a nice bonus and a nice add. It's also very important depending on what you're looking at. So if your topic is, again, accessibility, in-context observation becomes very important because as people are using, for example, devices with their disabilities, you're able to see how they're actually physically using those devices. It's also easier for mobile app testing because obviously you can just hand them your mobile phone. You can just go off of that. Related to that, on social economic accessibility, if your focus is users who may be low income, for example, they may not have access to the best technology. They may not have access to smartphones in general. And so by having them come in person, you're actually able to provide your devices, your environment for them to test in, which leads me to a controlled environment. So you're able to control the environment. You're able to say, let's meet up here in the place that's most natural to you, or let's meet up here in a laboratory setting where it's a little bit cleaner, everything is not going to be interrupted, whatever that may be. Of course, in person, more coordination for logistics required, just in how are we getting there? When are we meeting up? Where are we meeting up exactly? How do I find you? All of that. And then resources to travel. It requires at the minimum time, if not also gas or train or whatever that may be. On purpose, so we have explorative, assessment, and comparative, and I briefly went over each of them. On the explorative side, allowing users to explore freely gives you that very interesting, very natural view of how they would actually go through, download your product on their own, and just start figuring out how to use it and what they might be interested in doing on there. but that means it's also very little structure. So you have very low amount of control. And therefore, not all of your tasks may be explored. You may actually find that this person didn't hit a few of your major tasks that you really need to have covered. So for that purpose, I'm going to generally say, while explorative is great in certain circumstances, it probably is not going to be a good purpose for you in this phase for this challenge. On the assessment side, so we set key tasks for participants to try to achieve. We track preset measurements, so our metrics, whether that's time on task, success, perceived ease of use, whatever that may be. This allows direct comparisons between design iterations. As we go through, we can see whether task successes rise, whether the perceived ease of use rises, whether the time on task decreases, whatever that may be. And it's also quite structured, so there's less room for flexibility and natural interaction that you would get from an explorative side, but it allows you to account for finding major usability issues within key goals and key tasks. The comparative is, again, very similar to the assessment, but you're looking at it across products, so across different companies, rather than looking at it between your own iterations. And so you can look, for example, between Apple and Samsung. You can have a set of tasks for people to go through the Apple website and find the right phone that they're interested in and purchase it, versus on Samsung website. And compare the metrics that you're looking at between both of those to see where one site may come above one of the others and where it may fall below in some metrics. And this is also, again, quite structured. So on the recruitment side, again, it's going to be very similar to the discovery phase. It's all the same channels and everything, but I did want to pull up kind of two main areas. So use your discovery phase screener as a base, but alter it as needed. So figure out, what did you discover about who is and isn't your user? Sometimes you're going to run into some people in the discovery phase that, okay, actually you aren't quite who we wanted to talk to. Figure out why that is and how you might want to account for that in this screener. So add in questions, add in extra answers to some of the questions to account for those cases that you hit. Also note what screener questions were problematic. So how they were worded, options they had, whatever that may be, fix those issues. And also, if you recruited some who ended up not being in your target audience, again, figure out what caused them to not be in that target audience and how they can then be screened out appropriately next time. And also in recruiting, consider, from those people that you had contacted in the discovery phase and talked to, who could be the best fit for this usability testing, and would they be open to it? Go ahead and contact them. You didn't show them any designs yet, so there's no preconceived biases in what you did beforehand. If we had already done a design evaluation with them, that may be a different story. But given that this is your first iteration, you don't have any previous history there. And of the methods that you used in the past, consider what went well and what didn't go so well. How can you alter your approach to be more effective and accurate in recruitment? If you went through some channels and they really didn't work out, you got nothing out of it, don't waste your time with those channels this time. Go somewhere else, figure out something new. I'll flash this up briefly, and it's kind of insane. So you guys will have all these slides. You can look at it more in detail there, and I'll also include the link to the process that this goes through. But when you're looking at tracking analysis of things like tasks, you're going to want to typically put it into like a spreadsheet is most typical, because there you can see here, where's my thing? There we go. So here you can see what task is affected. So in this case, login using a social network, how critical it was. You can see where it occurred, so on the login page. And then you see the description where someone didn't recognize the Twitter option. Then you can assign impacts, and you can see how many people, they had 3 different participants here, how many people ran into this problem, which then gives you a frequency that you can calculate then severity based off of the criticality, impact, and frequency. So there's like a process into putting this all together that I'm not going to bother going through because it takes too much time to go through. But I'll leave this slide for you guys to have, and also the link to following this process in detail as well. But basically, you're going to want to be putting all of this together to track what are the usability issues that occurred, what kind of impact and severity did they have, how frequently did it occur, to then say, okay, based on all of our solutions that we have to the problems we identified, what is going to be the ones that we want to focus on? So this helps you then prioritize where you may want to focus your efforts based off of complexity to finish it in the first place, and also how effective it would be in addressing some of the issues that you found. But that gets very detailed, so we're going to zoom through that. Really quickly on the content side. So this is a really small bit, but basically what is content testing? It focuses on visual and written content, and it finds flaws in understanding and perception of content. Just because you wrote instructions out doesn't mean someone can follow it, doesn't mean that it's actually understandable for them. So it also finds these opportunities to improve. And also learning about users' behaviors and preferences. You may find even that they skip over very important text and then get confused later, even though you included the text there. That all goes back to content testing. So it has a very similar set of things to consider, whether you wanted to do it moderated or unmoderated, in context or out, what content is important to test, and what should we test the content for are going to be the two areas that I focus on that's a little bit different from what we went over with the usability testing. So this is largely all the same, just some modifications on the identify goals for testing side and also on the metrics side, because it's going to be more specific to content rather than tasks. So on the content testing side, when you're looking at actually identifying the goals for your testing, you want to determine what content you're actually going to consider testing in the first place. So where will users have to rely on content? This is things like important instructions, warning signs, error messages, and also what are key content areas that are necessary and informative versus just supplementary. You're going to want to focus on those that are necessary and informative to test over those that are just supplementary extra context behind different things. So some examples of content types to consider here. Testing your homepage. Your homepage is really the front of everything, or even your landing page on the mobile app. And that is going to be the key area that has really the key information for everyone to go through. So obviously that's going to be a very content heavy area. There's also navigation, error messages, warning states, menu buttons, filters, and even product and information pages as well. So when we're prioritizing, consider how critical is this content? So what are the potential repercussions on the user and the business if they aren't able to check out because they couldn't figure out how to go through the flow and how to actually follow the right instructions to enter what they needed? Then it's going to have very different repercussions than something that's really just a supplementary information bit that isn't necessary for them to know. And also consider what secondary research can be done on best practices for designing content patterns. There's actually a lot of information out there now, and a lot has come up within content testing on just best practices for how to arrange content, restrictions on how many words should be included in it, how to simplify how you go through instructions to make it easy to read, easy to glance at and consume. There's a lot out there, so rely very heavily on that secondary research as well. So with the metrics, this looks a little bit different from what we went over with usability testing. So first, what should you test the content for? You want to consider what is important to assess from your user's standpoint and how do they define success? So for example, there's five different areas here. So on usability, looking at ease of engagement, no one wants to read a huge manual just to figure out how to use a website. So we want to make sure that everything is concise and brief while still having the amount of information they need. On readability, does it require rereading to actually understand? Does someone have to read through the paragraph, go back up, read through it again, consider things, and then read through it again? That's probably not a great experience and shows that your content is not readable. On accessibility side, for those who are affected with disabilities, can this be understood by them? Can it be easily consumed? And can it be usable with whatever devices they may be using to be more accessible? Searchability leads itself to, can they actually find the content that they need? And tone and voice is, how do they perceive the tone and voice being used? So something like a banking website is going to come at you with a very tone and voice than something like a consumer website like Shutterfly, for example. They're going to have very different tones, and it's always good to know how your user is going to be perceiving what tone you're speaking in. And when breaking down into metrics, consider how you can quantify each of these above areas. So for example, with readability, How many times does the participant reread the content? Or how long does the participant spend looking at the content in the first place, are all things that you can quantify within readability. With tone and voice, you can look more at the experiential side. So how does the participant rate the content on friendliness, on confidence, on trustworthiness? Where do they identify you on all of these different emotions and tone? And so when it comes to deciding a method, again, there's the moderated versus unmoderated argument, and that is largely the same as usability, but just for some example methodologies. So again, you can do task-based usability, but you're going to have to keep the task open-ended and note how participants then engage with your content. So it's not so much heavy task-based as it is more of that explorative task. So this is great for label testing. So something like alerts may mean something very different to someone than notifications, but other people can actually mean the same thing. And so you can see how people naturally go through and perceive your content. There's also the cloze test. So that measures how well participants can understand a piece of text through context and prior knowledge. And this is basically giving them a piece of text that's typically about a paragraph long, and you remove every fifth or sixth word to test how many words participants can guess correctly. And so how they'd be able to fill in the gaps based on what they gathered through context and knowledge. Then there's the highlight test. So in this, again, you give them a piece of text or visual content, and you basically have them highlight different sentences, words, graphics, whatever that may be, based on how it makes them feel. So you can see where some things lead to higher confidence, some things lead to less confidence, some things lead to some lack of trustworthiness. And so you can see how some words that you're using could be perceived in different ways. Then there's also the 5-second test, which is presenting a design and giving them 5 seconds to view it, and then following up with questions. For example, what do you remember seeing? And that lets you see if information can be quickly absorbed and what information stands out to them. And then last but not least, card sorting. And so this is a very popular method for understanding hierarchy with content. And so this is basically giving participants cards that typically contain navigational items on them. So think about like a site hierarchy, a site architecture. And then they basically take those cards and bucket them into different groups and name those groups as they see fit. So you can look deeper into each of these methods if you're more interested in content testing, or feel free to reach out to me. But I did want to highlight that content testing is really also just as important as usability testing. And there are ways to include content testing within usability testing as well. But I did want to bring it up as a focus point.
Hey everyone, on behalf of IterateUX, we would like to thank you so much for watching this week's event. If you like the content, please leave a like and subscribe. We'll have events every Thursday at 5:30 Pacific Time. Join our Discord in the description to find out more.